Today we continue and really close a series, a journey we've been in, a statement that we've been talking about called Jesus plus nothing equals everything. It seems like such a simple statement, and we can read it and say it, and as I said in the very first week of the series, I think I'd get a lot of heads nodding yes. Yes, Jesus plus nothing equals everything. And yet, over the last couple of weeks, we've tried to dig into it and really reveal what does that mean? And what does that look like for life? And what kind of decisions do we make if we really believe the statement like that? That Jesus truly, even if we had nothing else, that Jesus plus nothing, not bad health, no finances, lack of job, kids being off track, if Jesus plus nothing could actually be everything that we're actually looking for. And we began this series with this common conversation about the fact that humans are searching for something. And humans don't even totally know what we're looking for, and yet we're looking for happiness, we're looking for meaning, we're looking for acceptance, we're looking for a purpose to our lives. That's why Amazon has so many books. If you just search how to be happy, you see there are like 16,000 or more books for sale on Amazon. I'll bet it's grown over the last couple of weeks. 16,000 books you could order this week on how to be happy. You know what that tells me? It's that we haven't found it yet. We don't know how to be happy as humans, that we search in all these places. Some look for success. Some look for fame, some look to pleasure, some look to the accumulation of things, whatever it may be, to the acceptance of others. But we find at the end of that very little. We don't find the meaning, the purpose, the hope that we're so longing to find at the end of that. And what that causes us to do is to begin to give our lives to lesser things than what can actually complete us, lesser things than the person of Jesus, who actually set the stars and the universe and knows all things, who created us, who made us, who knit us together in our mother's womb. We look to lesser things to fulfill us. And those lesser things, as we said week 2, can become idols that we give ourselves to, we give our hearts to, our time to, our money to, our affection to, our hope to, our trust to, our longings to, and those things leave us worse than they found us to begin with. Today's the last message of this series, these 5-week series. If you missed any of the talks, I encourage you to go back. Either you can watch on YouTube or you can listen to the podcast that's out there and catch up on what we missed. But today we wrap it up. And I was really praying this week, and I really had the majority of a message totally written or in the process of being written Thursday night, and I just felt an angst in my heart that it just wasn't what our church needed. And those of you who have known me for some time know that when I start a course, I almost never get off the course. I mean, if I go a direction, I'm going to finish that direction if it's the last thing I ever do. I just continue forward and prevail. But I was exercising Friday morning. Don't get too excited because it was the first time I've exercised in like months. But I was exercising Friday morning. I was working out, and I just kept saying, God, I just feel like what I prepared, it's right and it's true, but it doesn't feel like what we need to wrap a series as important as this up. I was praying and I was I was exercising, thinking I would be preparing later. And I felt like God directed me to scratch everything that I had written and start over. Which is a scary proposition if it's Friday morning and your work week kind of officially ends Thursday and you're scrapping everything you've done. And so I was up here till like 11 p.m. last night and then went home and worked on it a little bit more because I just felt like I got to be obedient to what God is saying to me. And so the title of my message this morning is When We Really Believe It. When we really believe it. If you have a Bible this morning, you can open with me to Mark chapter 14. This simple question that I kept dealing with as I was exercised, and I felt like, okay, what I'm going to talk about is right, but what does it look like if we really believed it? And here's my hunch. My hunch is I sort of believe it, that Jesus plus nothing equals everything. My hunch is that I kind of believe it, that I want to believe it, that I'm trying to believe it, that I'm asking God to kind of convince me that it's actually true. That when I look at my life and I look at the details of my life and how I live day in, day out, there's things about that way of life that tell me and convince me that I do believe it. And there's other things about the way that I do normal life that convince me that maybe I don't fully believe it. That maybe I'm looking for answers in places other than Jesus. In fact, we came back from vacation this week and so got back to work from Albuquerque, had a great time with our family and got back to work, which always creates a little angst. You know, you have a lot of work in front of you. You're like, man, how am I going to get all this done? Jesus, you're going to have to show up and see me through, and please don't make me start over my message on Friday morning, but after coming back from vacation. But that angst, and I was even dealing with just basic human longings in my heart, like for longer vacations, right? For easier life, for things to be more simple, right? Maybe you've had those thoughts before. And it convinced me that maybe there's times I don't really believe it. That Jesus could be everything even if I had nothing else with him. So I was praying, I was exercising. I'm glad the Lord spoke very quickly while I was on the treadmill. Maybe when your heart rate's going faster, you hear God faster. I'm not sure. But I felt like the Lord gave me this story that's in the New Testament that I wasn't thinking about at all. Although a friend reminded me that he had mentioned it several weeks ago to me, and I just hadn't even paid attention. But the Lord kept reminding me of this one story in Mark 14 of one woman who I think really did believe it and showed it by her actions. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. Mark 14, verse 1. It says, now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, meaning, if you stop there, that comment means Jesus is about to go to the cross and give his life upon the cross at Passover. So he's going to actually be the lamb, speaking back to the past. He's going to be this fulfillment of all that they've all talked about for thousands of years about the Passover lamb and how God passed over them in judgment. And he's going to go to a cross and he's going to pay the price for our sins at Passover. It's only 2 days away. He's on the cusp of giving his very life. And it says, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, they were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. Isn't that interesting? Jesus is on his way to pay for their sins, and they're scheming to kill him. It just shows such a divide of what's happening in that moment. That God is beginning to unravel or bring about everything that he has planned to do from the very beginning, and yet there's people standing against God's activity. They're scheming to kill him, it says, to arrest him and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. That's an important point because the crowds have been growing. They're beginning to believe Jesus is somebody, that he's healing people. He's teaching in a way that's breaking through to them, that they're beginning to understand things that they never understood about God. And so these crowds are growing around them, and they're going to one of the greatest feasts of the year there at Passover. So all these thousands of people are journeying into Jerusalem, and they say, look, we can't do it right now because the crowds are against us. We'll wait till they dissipate, or we'll do it in quiet, and they won't even know what has happened before it's all over. Which speaks to the fact that there's lots of opinions about Jesus. Jesus was very polarizing in his moment. There were those who loved him and were following him, and the crowds were growing, and yet those were standing against him, which is the same as it is today. Jesus has this polarizing effect on all people, where some begin to believe that he is who he says he is, and others reject him as maybe a made-up fairy tale, or maybe it's blown out of proportion what he claimed about himself. Very polarizing, and that was the case even here in this story. Verse 3, but while he was in Bethany, which is very close to Jerusalem, very close to where he will go and give his life upon the cross, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Made of pure nard. And she broke the jar and she poured the perfume on his head. Poured the perfume on his head. We read that a woman came to him, and we think, well, maybe they didn't know, maybe they didn't recount, we don't know who the woman is, but that's not true. We actually do know who the woman is, because this story is retold over and over and again in the Gospels. It's one of the most retold stories in all of the Gospels, this one story of what this one woman does. The woman's name is Mary. And she has a sister named Martha. And Mary and Martha have been in it together, and they have these moments with Jesus, and they know Jesus well. And why do they know Jesus well? Because they have a brother named Lazarus. And the story of Lazarus is that Lazarus dies, and yet he's a great friend of Jesus. And the sisters run to Jesus and say, your friend, the one you love, he has died. Come back with us. Jesus finally goes back and finds Lazarus dead, and dead for several days. And Jesus walks into the tomb, and he calls to Lazarus and said, your day's not over. Get up and walk. And so Mary hasn't just been on the outside looking in. She watched Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead, which would have the impact of changing what you think about Jesus, wouldn't it? I mean, if you had a loved one, and we've all lost loved ones, people we care deeply about, if Jesus rose any one of them from the dead in this life, you would tell everyone you ever encountered for the rest of your life. You would believe different things about Jesus. You would believe deeper things about Jesus, bigger things about Jesus than you even might believe here this morning. And especially if you didn't know what to believe about Jesus and you saw him do something like that, you'd say, I can't deny what I saw. I can't deny that he is who he claims to be. He just raised my brother from the dead. This is Mary. Mary, Martha, Lazarus. They're all there in this moment. And Mary comes in and she takes this alabaster jar, a very expensive perfume made of pure nard. What is pure nard? It's actually spices, sweet-smelling spices that come from the mountains of India. Now, they're in Israel, which is a long distance from India if you've ever looked on a world map. And not only is it a long distance, but they didn't have trains or planes or automobiles, right, that would get the spices. And so to own something from the northern parts of India, likely maybe even in the region of Nepal where the pure nard would have come from, would have been something that no one else maybe in the town would have owned. It would have been a very rare thing to own, and she's probably been holding on to this for some time. In fact, she may have had it for years and years and years, never have an occasion big enough for a moment like this. And she takes this jar. There's an important part in it. It didn't have like a twist off top where you could just use a little bit or dab it on your wrist, as women often do, right? It had a jar that would have required them to break the neck off of it, meaning she was going to use it all that day. There was no going back. When she got there, she broke the neck. There was no chance to kind of rethink what she was doing. And she took what she had and she anointed his head with the most expensive perfume anyone could have ever had. The Gospel of John says not only did she anoint his head, meaning pour it on his head and let it drip down his head as a statement of great honor and love and affection towards him, but the Gospel of John recounts it with slightly different detail. It says that she got down on her knees and she took her hair and she wiped his feet and cleaned his feet. Now, I know the women in the room, you know the reality of that. That means that you would take his feet home with you and your hair. That's something that we spend lots of money getting our hair right. And for her to take her hair, it's about as intimate a thing as you could, and clean his feet. This is no normal moment. This is not the everyday encounter, hey, good to see you. This is her giving the most precious things of herself to Jesus, which leads me to believe that she really believed it. She really believed the gospel. She really believed Jesus was who he says he is. Said he was. And so therefore she took in this moment as an act of worship, she took the most precious things that she owned and had, and she gave them to the one who was more precious to her than the perfume she had held on to for years. She said, this Jesus is everything. And if I have nothing else in this life, then I have more than I could have ever asked for. This is how she saw Jesus. And this is how men and women who see Jesus truly as the everything live their lives. And the reality is, none of us are there yet. I think back to my life, and there's moments I'm like, I think that was a moment when I really believed it. Not just like slightly believed it or 80% believed it, which is a lot of days maybe for me by the grace of God, but I 100% believed it. I went all in. This is her moment, and I'll bet she struggled with other moments that were difficult and challenging. But this was her moment when she believed it all the way. Verse 4, some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor. And they rebuked her harshly. It seems sort of reasonable at first. They're like, look, you could have taken this perfume. It's worth so much. In fact, it says a year's salary. I just want you to think back, what's a year's salary to you? And I don't want you to think about your worst year's salary. I want you to think about your best year's salary in your whole life. And for me, imagine my wife saying, I'd like to buy some perfume. Costs a little bit more than normal. It might cost a whole year's salary. Is that okay? I would say indignantly. Why waste so much on perfume? I had to look up indignantly. Indignantly What a big word. I've used it. I'm like, I think I have felt indignant about things before. Have you ever felt indignant? I wasn't quite sure how to describe what that means, but I know I felt it. This is the idea. It's this idea of disgust or anger, strong displeasure, when you can feel indignant about something that's happening that doesn't seem right, doesn't feel fair, doesn't seem worth it, and they look at her and indignantly say, why this waste of perfume? And it says they rebuked her. I mean, we're going to talk about this as one of the greatest examples of faith, which shows where they were at the moment. They rebuke her for the most beautiful thing she could have possibly done to Jesus. John, the Gospel of John, will tell the rest of the story. He says not only were they indignant, it's actually one man in particular is especially frustrated, and his name is Judas Iscariot. It's because he doesn't yet really believe it. He doesn't yet understand fully what to think about who Jesus is. And the Gospel of John will say the reason he is so a proponent of saving the money to give it to the poor is because Judas would carry the money bag. He was the treasurer. He would handle all the finances. And he says, we should have used it for the poor, when in reality, the Gospel of John will say that Judas used to take the money that was given to Jesus' ministry so they could eat at night, so they have a place to stay, so that they could take care of the poor. And Judas would just take out whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. And the idea is that Jesus knew all along what Judas was doing. It's not like Jesus was caught off guard. He didn't understand what Judas was doing. He was giving Judas time to come around, giving Judas time to make a better decision, to really believe it. And yet Judas was taking out the money that was put in there, meaning Judas didn't understand who Jesus was. In fact, there's this great dichotomy, two totally different stories happening. You have one woman who's beginning to really believe it, and you have another man who doesn't believe it at all, who doesn't know what to believe, but certainly doesn't want to believe what she's doing makes sense, because Jesus isn't all that matters in this life. Leave her alone, verse 6, Jesus said. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime that you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Remember, 2 days later, he's going to be crucified and buried. They don't understand it. They don't understand everything that is happening, but he understands what's happening. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, like in 2017 at Anthem Church, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. It's an amazing story because on one hand, you have a group saying this is a waste to do all these things. It doesn't make sense to do all these things. And on the other hand, Jesus calls what she does beautiful, appropriate, perfect, as she gives all that she has. Verse 10, the end. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the saddest moments in all of the Bible, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this, and they promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Two people, one really believed and gave all that they have. One didn't believe and was really along for the ride to take something, to get something out of it. In fact, Judas had heard Jesus talking about this kingdom he's going to establish and these things he's going to do. And so Judas hooked his life up with someone who was going somewhere. Judas thought, maybe I can get wealthier if I follow Jesus. Maybe if I go with Jesus, that something great will happen to me. Maybe I'll have a great position in the kingdom. And in this moment, when Jesus is anointed and Jesus keeps talking about dying, and Judas is like, I don't really understand what he's talking about. And when he gets anointed and Jesus says, I've been anointed for my burial, and Judas realizes that Jesus isn't going to just pass all the finances on to him all the time. Judas goes, I don't think I'm going to get out of this what I thought I was going to get out of it. In fact, I think maybe this is more about Jesus than it is about me. And Judas jumped ship. While one woman went all in with all of her heart, soul, mind, and strength, the other one pulled the ripcord and parachuted out of this journey he was on with Jesus. I was thinking this week, especially Friday and Saturday, what would it look like if we really believed it? What would we do if we really believed it? What would we stop doing if we really believed it? How would my life change if I really believed it? Here's what I think would happen. Well, first, I think we would stop holding back with God. I think we'd stop holding back. And if you don't know you're holding back, I know you're holding back because every human holds back. Every person holds back. Everyone's holding back. And there's gradients. There's some people holding back a lot. And in this room, you know who you are. You know you're holding back lots of things from God. There's others in this room who have progressed and we're maturing. We're holding less things back, but we're still struggling to hold on to things and hold things back from God. But this woman who really believed it, did she hold anything back? I mean, I think a year's salary in one moment, it lasted probably 3 minutes, right? And she gave all that she had. You know what I just began as I just meditated on this passage? I thought, Brett, if I really believed it, I would hold nothing back from Jesus any longer. Not only that, but I'd stop caring what people think about what I do with my life or don't do with my life. I'd stop caring about what people think about how seriously I take my faith, right? The people who think, I think you go too far, right? You're kind of giving too much energy. Or maybe I heard a story once of parents who lived with Christ, brought their kids to church all the time, all growing up, and the kids finally grew up and matured and gave their life to Christ, and they said, you know what, Mom and Dad, I think God's calling me to be a missionary in a distant place. The parents like, look, let's not get too radical. Let's just get a good education, a good job. Let's pay our bills. Let's we don't need to go that far. Jesus doesn't want us to do that much. And I think that's such a tragedy. Not that they should go or not should go. You have to wrestle through those things, pray through those things, not be frivolous with those decisions. But the saddest part is that we damp down what it looks like to really believe it, which would cause us to hold nothing back. Jesus, you say go, I'll go. Jesus, want me to stay? I'll stay. Jesus, you want me to do this? I'll do this. Or that, I'll do that. Or stop this or start that. God, whatever you want, I'm going to hold nothing back. Not try to hold on to this world and hold on to you at the same time, but just hold on to you and let go of all that is else. To hold nothing back. I think that's how I would live. And I think that's how you would live. And I don't know where everybody is spiritually here this morning. Some of you may be asking questions about faith. You're just really on a process. That's great. You shouldn't be at a point where you're ready to hold nothing back. I mean, it's a journey. You got to figure out who Jesus is, what do you believe. But once you really believe it, you know what I believe? You would stop holding anything back in your relationship with God. Here's an example of holding back. Jesus, I've said yes to you in so many areas of my life, but this thing I really want to keep doing. Maybe this sin, it's like, look at all the things I don't do. Everybody does all these other things. I don't do any of those things. This thing is so small. Why worry about it? I want to hold on to that. Jesus, maybe a graduate is like, I've given you 90% of your life, which would be a great feat. I'm not sure any of us have done it. But let's just say, hypothetically, I've given Jesus 90% of my life, but this 10% I want to hold on to and hold that back for myself. Or to give a more practical example, in the area of financial, what do we do with our finances and our giving? I haven't talked about this much at Anthem, but I'm a big believer that Jesus calls us to go above and beyond with our finances, to give away from ourselves to the poor and the needy and the mission of the local church around the world, to missions causes. Why? Because it begins to divorce us from the holding on to the stuff of this world. There's like a fight, a war that's happening in my soul. And so I say, look, I don't believe God just wants me to finally get to the point where I give 10%. I think God's calling me further. Why? Because maybe at some point that gets easy. It's still a holding back. Like, I got 90%, God's got 10%. I don't think that's it. It's all His. It's a challenge. I understand it's a journey. Some of us are like, I'm struggling to give $10 to any cause. I get it, but there's a war happening in your soul. Hold back. We're like, I'm going to follow God with abandonment, but I'm going to hold on to my finances. That stuff gets in the way, and it causes us to ask the question, do we really believe it? I don't mean do we really just believe that Jesus went to a cross and rose again. I mean, do we really believe that Jesus plus nothing equals everything? And if we did, I believe we would stop holding back. And I think we'd stop talking about things in our life when I say no to sin, or I do something with my life, or I go on a mission trip to Mexico, and I stop using language like I'm making a sacrifice. I think we would just stop doing that. Because it's not really a sacrifice, it's a trade. It's a trade that becomes an investment, and it's not a trade that I give Jesus something and he gives me something back. It's like I give him my nothings, and I trade up. I gain more than I could ever give away from myself in any manner. I say no to sin thinking that somehow I'm making a sacrifice to follow Jesus, when Jesus leads me to abundant life as a result. And my trades become investments that grow, and they're better than all that I could have ever given away from myself. And we begin to say, you know what, the no holding back. You think if they interviewed her afterwards and say, was that a tough sacrifice? And she'd be like, yeah, it was really hard. It was really hard, and I'm kind of regretting it. I think she'd say, it was the best moment of my life. It was the most important thing I've ever done. To give all that I had at the feet of the one who loved me and called me by name from my mother's womb, who rose from the grave, my brother, and who has promised that we will be with him for eternity. And so in this Christian life, you know what can't really work well is this idea of having like 1 foot in with Jesus and 1 foot in the world. It's like my kids who sometimes are like, I want to take a bath, and then I run the bath water and they put their toe in, like they're just going to test it for a while. I get it. You shouldn't just jump into a bathtub, right? You're like, what are you talking about? My kids literally want to jump into the bathtub. It goes everywhere. But they'll just dip their toe in and figure out, is it too hot or too cold? And then they'll say, I want it up or down. I'm like, look, I can't get all your whims right. Just get in the bathtub. But I think sometimes in faith, maybe it's not the perfect example, but we want to put our toe in with Jesus. And maybe for years. I don't mean just even for a moment. For years. And just kind of keep testing it out, but keep doing things the way we've always done it. But I think if we really believe it, we'd be done with 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And we would jump both feet in and do what God asks us and calls us to do. That's when it becomes the giving of our hearts to Jesus becomes simple and logical when we actually believe it. It becomes a logical step of faith when I believe he is who he says he is. It makes sense, right? If I thought that I was going to give $10 and get $100 back, I would do it every day, every minute of every day, wouldn't you? It's the same thing with our faith. When I give away my lesser things, he gives me better things. And I'm not talking about when I give money, he gives me money. Or when I do this, I'm going to get better health and everything's going to be rosy in this life. God can do many incredible things. The promise is in the life that is to come, anything that's given away will be stored up as treasure in heaven. And we won't get there and go, I wish I held on to that. I wish I held on to that. I wish I had done it my way. We'll see it as it is. And that is that Jesus is the greatest one who's ever lived. He is our Savior. He is our King. He is our God. He is the place where we find, this is really the point, find our happiness and our meaning. And every time I'm holding on to lesser things, it's because I believe that I can somehow find it there still. And Jesus is saying, look, just give me that, the garbage you're hanging on to, and I will give you myself. And myself will fulfill the holes in your heart. I think if we really believed it, we would stop holding back. As well as that, if we really believed it, I believe we would begin placing our hope in Christ alone. In Christ, you hear it? Alone. We would begin to place our hope, our expectations, our desires in Christ alone. And when I feel angst in my life or unfulfilled in my life or I'm looking for meaning in my life, I'll stop looking to other things and I'll run back to Christ alone. To give me the hope that I'm looking for in my heart. To push back all the things in this life, all the advertising we see, all the things we think if we buy we'll be happier, all the things that if we can achieve that will somehow fill the gap in our whole. I was talking to somebody after first service and they said, I'm so glad I was here. She hasn't been here in a year. And she was here, she's like, on Friday, which I found interesting. She said, on Friday I felt like God was telling me I gotta go to church. So I've been struggling. I really want to take this job in Kansas, but I feel like my family's not totally on board. And I just feel like that's the right job for me, but I just had to lay it down. I feel so broken inside. She's like, I needed to be here because I've been trying to put my hope in things in addition to Christ, thinking that that job would fulfill me and being frustrated with my husband because he doesn't want to move across the country. She said, I needed to be here. It's like, on Friday. You felt this on Friday. And she said, yeah. I was like, maybe it was for you, right? We begin to put our hope in Christ alone. No longer my job to fulfill me, my bank account to fulfill me, another person to fulfill me, an experience to fulfill me, pleasure to fulfill me, success to fulfill me, stuff to fulfill me, what others think about me to give me purpose and hope. Instead, I begin to put it completely and totally in Christ and Christ alone. He alone can satisfy. And there, when that happens, we can then do what God always intended. We can enjoy the things of this life. I can enjoy my kids and enjoy my wife and enjoy my job and enjoy the chance to preach the gospel. I can do all these things, but I don't put my hope in them to be able to fulfill me. I just enjoy them as God's gift to me, but not as a means to happiness and fulfillment on their own, because only Christ can satisfy what's missing in the human heart. And that's God's gift to us. Not only would I stop holding back and I'd start placing my hope in Christ alone, but I would then also begin to live every day in light of eternity. Every day in light of eternity, knowing, you know what, I have longings and hopes and dreams in this life, but you know what? What I believe from the gospel is they're never going to be fulfilled in this life, that it's in the life that is to come where I actually find the fulfillment that I'm longing for. That completing, that joy, that happiness that I taste in this life, momentary, that like I feel like I'm scratching on the surface, like just touch it, but it's fleeting and it runs away from me as soon as I touch it. Those things I taste in this life, you know what? I begin to live with an eye towards eternity, knowing that it's in eternity where I'm actually going to find everything I'm looking for. That Jesus is here with us now. He comes and lives inside those who are believers, and yet he hasn't yet totally revealed himself fully to us and the way that he will on the other side of eternity. And so I live with an understanding, you know what? Some of my longings that I'm looking for, the angst I have that I can't seem to fix inside myself, that's normal in this life. And as Christians, I hope that we hear that this morning, because there's an already but a not yet of Jesus' promises. There's an already. Jesus' promise, comfort, to come be with us, to know us closely, to fulfill us in every way. There is a sense in which he's already promised it and he's already doing it, and yet there's a not yet to it. It's not quite there yet, that he has more plans for the future. Let me give you an example. Jesus has promised to come alongside and comfort those who weep. Have you ever heard that before? The promise in the New Testament, he says, I will comfort those who weep. But you know what? In the life that is to come for those that are in Christ Jesus, he promised there will be no more tears. You hear what I'm saying? So in this life, we have a certain amount of fulfillment of what Jesus has said, but it's incomplete. And your longings and what you're hoping for and the happiness you're searching for will never be fully complete in this life. And you know that to be true because you've tried. You have moments and seasons, but then they can be followed by other seasons and other moments. But Jesus says when you cross over to the life that is to come, that all that will be totally completed and finished. And your longing and my longings, and the things that are missing in my life and I'm hoping for, Jesus says, look, just trust me. When we cross over together, that I will be there. You know what they say about heaven? So there'll be no more sun in heaven, which sounds incredible. Maybe that makes sense. It says because Jesus will provide so much light, there's no need for the sun. There's no need for any other light. What does that tell us? Jesus is the everything we're looking for and everything we need. And he's at the center of heaven itself. By the way, heaven, everyone wants to go to heaven. I mean, 99.9% of people want to go to heaven. Some people joke that say, if that's what heaven's like, I'd rather go somewhere else. But that's not what they really mean. They really mean they want to go to that place that they imagine is better than anywhere they've ever been before. Everyone longs for it. Not everyone believes in heaven, but everyone longs for the idea of heaven. To be with family members for forever, to be in a place that's filled with joy and happiness, that's what we long for. You know what the Bible actually describes heaven as? It's two different things. One is the place. It's a place that we go. Yes, it is in a sense. But even more than that, it describes heaven as a person. Did you know that? Like heaven is described, if you read the book of Revelation, or read throughout the Bible, every time heaven is described, it really always goes right back to the one who's in the middle of it all, and that is Jesus. That our own definition of heaven is not so much streets of gold or pearly gates or emeralds or all these amazing ways they described heaven and its magnificence, but it's ultimately about this person who's at the center of eternity. Why does that matter? Because if we believe that we desire that place like heaven, paradise, whatever that might be, which is a longing that's been in us from the Garden of Eden that we lost, this longing, this angst that things aren't the way it should be. We know somehow in humanity that things aren't complete because we walked and talked with God in the garden before everything came apart. Jesus says, when I come back for you, we will recreate all that was and make it even better still. And I will be there at the center of all things. And so when we say Jesus plus nothing equals everything, we're actually making a statement about eternity as well. That everything we're looking for, that paradise, that heaven, that happiness we're looking for, it's with Jesus because Jesus is the source of it all. And so when your heart is broken and when you're struggling and when you feel angst and you hate your job and you're not sure about your boss and you feel like you're not amounting to anything or whatever it may be for you in your life, or your relationships are wrong, look, a lot of that is normal in this life. We live instead with an eye towards eternity, when all things that are in our heart that feel missing will be completed. And therefore that gives us the strength in this life to stop holding so tightly to this life. And I've walked and talked with Christians for a long time, as you have. We struggle to hold tightly to this life. But this life is but a breath. It's just a moment. And it can never fulfill in a way that the life that is to come can fulfill. So we stop holding so tightly to this life, and we start longing for the life that is to come, the path that's in front of us. And we live every day in Jesus' name. We don't give up on this life, but we look with an eye towards eternity, to what is to come. And we expect only to be half fulfilled now, but fully fulfilled in the life that is to come. Husbands, stop putting so much pressure on your wives to fulfill you. Wives, stop putting so much pressure on your husband to fulfill you. Parents, stop putting so much pressure on your kids to meet up. Stop putting so much pressure on yourself to be somebody. Because we can only be so fulfilled in this life. But Jesus is the everything we're looking for, and he is still ahead of us, awaiting us to come. As I close the message today, I thought, how can I put a period on this series? There's so much else I'd love to say. How can I put a period on it? And how do we really describe the gospel and the message of the Bible, knowing that not everyone here maybe even has begun a relationship with Christ, has even begun that journey? How do we put a statement at the end? And here's how I want to describe the gospel to us. The good news that the Bible declares, whether you believe it or not here this morning, this is the message of the Bible through and through. And that is the gospel, that God is the gospel, that Jesus is the gospel. It really doesn't get more complicated than that. Jesus is the gospel. That person is the gospel. That's why the woman took her alabaster jar that she had saved for who knows how long, and who knows who paid for it, and she broke the neck off of it, and she was there at Jesus, and she anointed his head, and she wiped his feet with her hair. Why would you do that? Because God, through Jesus Christ, was the greatest hope she had ever encountered. She says, I don't need to hold so tightly to this world. I can live with an eye towards eternity. I know this perfume itself, or the hope of maybe meeting someone one day. I don't know if she's married or single in the story, right? The hope of meeting someone one day. I know those things ultimately won't fulfill me. They could be good things. I can delight in them. They may be gifts from God, but I don't have to put my hope and trust in them. I'm going to put it in this one who's walking and talking among us, this Jesus. And then 2 days later, she watched him die on a cross. And then 3 days later, rose from the grave. And she said, no regrets. No regrets. Jesus plus nothing, if I can declare it simply today, is everything. There is nothing else in this world you will find, or in the world that is to come, you can fulfill like Jesus. He made you. He knows what you need. And he gave that final gift upon a cross so that you can have a relationship with him. And that is the gospel. God is the gospel. He is the good news. His character, his nature, and his provision for humanity is the gospel. Let's bow our heads and let's pray.